I'd like to welcome you all to the 6th Annual Naval Heritage presentation. I'd like to thank Raytheon Corporation for their consideration, their caring, their involvement, and their sponsoring of this event, which they have now done for 5 consecutive years. Tonight's subject, as you know, is the U.S. landing at Inchon in September of 1950. And I think we have a great panel of speakers. And in keeping with the surprise speaker, as we were sitting here tonight, one of the gentlemen at the podium walked in and said, "Gee, you're going to talk about Inchon, huh?" I was there. I led the first wave at Blue Beach. And immediately he became an SNA member and was on the podium. No stone goes unrewarded. Our panel tonight is very distinguished. Mr. Curtis Schutz, a noted historian, will talk and lay out the story and the development of the battle. We have Lieutenant Commander Joseph Dixon, who was on the bridge of the Lyman Swenson in a squadron called the Sitting Ducks, named appropriately because they were directed into the harbor in Inchon to see just how accurate and how effective the North Korean guns were. And they found out. We also have Colonel Warren Whedon, who at the battle was a PFC, who was in one of the first waves at Red Beach, and he's going to tell us all about going up that ladder onto the shore and facing the North Korean guns. And our surprise guest tonight was then Lieutenant J.G. Byron Bartholomew, who was the first wave boat commander from the USS Bear at Blue Beach. So I think we are really looking forward to their experiences and their history and a real good understanding and a telling of the story of the invasion or the landing at Inchon. In the summer of 1950, the U.S. was facing a rather interesting situation not far from today. Post-war recession, military cutbacks, demobilization, mothballing of tremendous amounts of equipment, both Navy and Marine Corps. A strategic focus that was not on the Far East, but was rather very much in Europe. North Korean forces were encouraged by the Soviet Union and by China to seek an advancement and invade the South. And they did so after a rather interesting conversation one night in Washington between a diplomat and a Russian diplomat, where that diplomat said, Korea, that's outside the sphere of our influence. And some people say it's a coincidence, but history will say that just 2 months later, the North Koreans came south. They outgunned us and they outmanned us. And they basically overran the South, pushing U.S. and UN forces down to a place called Pusan, where the 8th Army set up a perimeter that was about 10 miles wide. And survival of the country of Korea and the Korean forces and the UN forces was very much in doubt. And so a landing at Inchon was hatched, something to take off the pressure, to surprise the Koreans and change the course of the operation. It's often regarded by many historians as one of the most daring and surprising amphibious attacks in history because tides, 26 feet, currents, a narrow channel, and an almost impossible logistics line deemed the attack not only improbable, but pretty much virtually impossible. Yet the Marine Corps consolidated all their manpower, and you'll hear about a little about that tonight, took a whole bunch of equipment out of activation. By the way, the compasses didn't work. You'll hear about that tonight. Just a significant amount of aging equipment, embarked it on amphibious vessels, some of which that had not been used for quite some time, and put together a landing that was incredibly successful and turned the tide of the combat in the Korean conflict. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the landing at the Battle of Inchon. Mr. Kurtz?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Curtis Schutz. I am a historian and archivist with the Naval History and Heritage Command. We are the Navy's official history office based over in the Washington Navy Yard. And when I was first working with the command about 15 years ago. I did a study on the landing at Inchon, and as you've heard, we were dealing with a situation that was quite horrific to deal with in the Far East, given what we had to deal with as far as our enemy and as far as what we lacked to pull off such an audacious and complex operation. And as you can see here in the first slide we've got, you're talking about taking a landing into a city, including going over seawalls at high tide. And in fact, the individual pictured getting out of that LCVP is Marine Corps First Lieutenant Bartolomé Lopez, who will be dead in about 5 minutes, was awarded the Medal of Honor for sacrificing his life when assaulting his third bunker within those 5 minutes, along with a rifle squad, was wounded while he was about to hurl a grenade and dropped the grenade because he'd been struck in the arm, and he rolled on the grenade so it wouldn't kill the rest of the men in his squad. So, and for those of you who work with certain types of ship, you realize there is a hull named after him. Now, we've already heard some mention of what the weakness of U.S. forces were in 1950. This gives you an idea of what we're actually talking about, particularly the paucity of forces in the Far East. I mean, the numbers pretty much speak for themselves. Not a whole lot going on there. The photo there is of the light cruiser Juno, which was actually the heaviest unit in Japan at the time of the landing. Now, one item that I do not have listed here, and is very fortuitous that it was there, was the first amphibious group had been brought out from San Diego in the late spring of 1950 because they wanted to do some amphibious exercises with the Army troops that were on occupation duty in Japan. Because who's the commander-in-chief in the Far East? Douglas MacArthur. And he's like, you know, my Army guys used to be able to do something with the amphibious work. I think they need to do a little more work with that. Now, as far as the early operations, again, limited number of forces. Our destroyers were doing things like evacuating people from the peninsula, including evacuating diplomats from Seoul out through the port of Inchon. One of the most significant surface actions early in the war was actually fought by this ship here, a U.S. PCE, which had been given to the South Koreans. This is a vessel armed with a single 3-inch gun, 650 caliber machine guns, and she duked it out at rifle ranges with an armed transport that was trying to get into Busan with a reinforced battalion of North Korean troops. This ship sank it. So that was critical to saving the port of Busan. And basically, you're doing various gunfire support and trying to get forces into Korea. Now, as already was mentioned, I mean, we've got a map over on the far left and this map here. Busan's down in the far corner of the country, close to Japan. But most of the logistics that come down from the north, most of the major transportation systems, go through the capital, Seoul, which is just below the 38th parallel. Inchon lies approximately 15 miles from Seoul. If you can launch an amphibious force around deeply into the North Korean flank, sees Inchon move forward, sees Seoul, you can cut off the army in the south. And that was MacArthur's objective. I mean, MacArthur understood how amphibious operations worked and what they were capable of doing. He had great experience with that in the Pacific. But as already mentioned, this is an operation with, I mean, tremendous challenges. We've already talked about some of the challenges with forces. This is the kind of place you have to operate in. This is a photograph taken after the landing, but, you know, the tide dropped so fast and so great. I mean, at extreme high tide, the tidal range is over 30 feet. The speed in the channel is in excess of 5 knots. When I was writing this book, I asked a DD and frigate, or former DD and frigate officer who was in the command at the time, in fact still is, and I said, what would be the challenge of having to take landing craft or any sort of small vessel or an LST or anything into such a landing being pushed by a 5 or 6 knot current? He looked at me and he said, many. And I said, okay, this is why you got to talk to these people. But again, you have a whole lot of issues that you have to contend with that normally you never do in amphibious operations. I mean, Arleigh Capps, who was the gunnery officer for Admiral Doyle, the FIBGRU commander, said, you know, basically draw up a list of things you should never do in an amphibious landing. Inchon had every one of them. Getting ready for the landing, organizing the forces. We've already seen how weak the forces were in the Far East, and we had to rely on a wide variety of items. We had to bring forces in from CONUS. We had to bring forces in from the Med. UN forces, as listed, contributed pretty significantly and pretty early on, which is something that's often forgotten, particularly, you know, the old elements of the British Commonwealth. And one of the critical issues, absolutely critical issues, was the shortage of LSTs. Luckily, there were excess LSTs in Japan. These were LSTs that had been given over to the Shipping Control Administration Japan after the war because most of their local merchant marine had been destroyed. And we brought about 8 of them back into service, armed them, manned them with U.S. crews. But a critical element that is often overlooked, and you can see in the 4th picture from the left, one of the LSTs at Inchon, 30 of the 47 LSTs that went into Inchon were manned by the Japanese, fighting under UN colors, you know, which is something very, very rarely understood. All right, Inchon's a bad place, and these gentlemen can give you a whole lot more detail on some of these challenges, but as part of preparing to go in and land on the 15th of September, you basically have to go up narrow Flying Fish Channel and shoot it out with the North Koreans because you want to understand how much damage has actually been done. And as was mentioned, these guys were known as the sitting ducks. You basically go up, anchor, let the tide turn you because the tide's running in, and open fire. And several of the destroyers received counter fire from the North Korean positions, particularly on the island of Wolmido, which sort of sat in the middle of the harbor and overlooked the landing beaches that would be used on the 15th. One thing that was also very lucky about this, the threat of mines. What if you've got a narrow channel to defend? It's the easiest, cheapest way to do it. Luckily, the North Koreans had not had time to get many mines planted. They were the old-style contact mines. And when the ships from the destroyers went up and saw these, there's no minesweepers with them. We're so short of escort ships, minesweepers are back trying to get the LSTs up there. They're literally shooting at them from everything from rifles up to 40 millimeters, trying to detonate them. And fairly successful, as I recall, in some cases. There's a map of the harbor, sort of shows you how narrow the channel is. Essentially, from north to south, you have Red Beach in the north, which would be assaulted in the evening. In the center, you have Green Beach, the beach that would be assaulted during the morning high tide, approximately 6:30 in the morning. And then down to the south, Blue Beach, which would also be assaulted on the evening high tide. And again, some of the destroyer positions are shown on this map and shows you how close in these individuals are working to the shore. Morning landing, Green Beach. It was critical to take this island. The island had been well fortified, at least we thought fairly well fortified, and it went under a great deal of fire. In addition to the naval gunfire, Marine Corps Corsairs had been launching attacks at it for 2+ days, including basically blanketing the entire place with napalm. So it was pretty well worked over. The landing went in. The landing was very successful, and the Marines moved up as far as a causeway that actually led from the island into the city itself. The evening landing, as mentioned, 2 assaults. Red Beach, which this is a photo of, and you can see sort of the chaos you're having to go into. Again, remember, you're going in being pushed by a 5 or 6 knot current, and when you land, you're going into the city. You're going up against seawalls, which faced many challenges. One of the other challenges not thought about was, by a lot of folks, but professionals understand this, you leave a landing force on the shore, because when the tide starts receding about 7 o'clock at night, you got 30 feet of mud flats. They beached 8 LSTs with sufficient supplies, ammunition, food, water, and medical teams to provide support overnight on Red Beach, which was very, very critical to that success. Blue Beach. And again, the speaker who will follow me will speak far more to this, but you're downwind from Red Beach. Everything's blowing down over you. It's a very long run in. You have no real idea where you're going, and because you can't see the target. And the LVTs, which the Marines were using, had been pulled out of storage in Barstow, hauled over to San Diego and Long Beach, pulled out to the Pacific, and just really were not in the best of equipment shape. In many cases, there's no compasses, or the compasses do not work properly. And the late Brigadier General Simmons of the Marine Corps, who was actually a battalion commander at Inchon, said, he's literally standing on the roof of his LVT under small arms fire with a lensatic compass, trying to figure out if he can even get anything off of that. He's also very concerned with his driver, who is a Marine Corps reservist, and he's like, "Son, do you know what you're doing?" And he looks up and he says, "Sir, 6 weeks ago I was driving a bus in Seattle." He hadn't been in an LVT since 1945. So again, a whole lot of challenges, and in fact, LVTs would have been the best thing to use here, but in fact, I think it was only a total of 4 waves that went in with LVTs. Everybody else came in the LCVPs. In conclusion, it was quite successful. I mean, this is one of the most audacious amphibious assaults against a relatively impossible target in the history of warfare. And really, absolute credit for pushing this idea and getting people to accept it from the local level all the way up to the Joint Chiefs does have to fall on MacArthur. He really thought that this would work and be successful. And in combination with an assault from the Pusan perimeter, it did push the North Korean army out of the south, but it didn't destroy it. And even though I've been speaking about MacArthur, I think these two characters, and characters is a word I should not use, these two individuals who had so much to do with the success of this landing. On the left is O.P. Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division, and on the right is Admiral James Doyle, who is commander of the 1st Amphibious Group. And the fact that these individuals, with their extensive experience in World War II and their ability to work under extreme conditions to get a landing through, I mean, these two individuals just absolutely outstanding. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my presentation. Next up will be then Lieutenant J.G. Bartholomew, who went in on Blue Beach. Thank you.
Afternoon. I didn't know I was going to be a speaker till about an hour ago, so don't have any notes, but I'll tell you my story about Inchon, as I've told my interested grandchildren. My story starts really well before Inchon. I was on board the USS Bear, BEXAR, APA 237. Our normal contingent when we practiced exercises was an 1,800-man battalion landing team. Well, we were sitting in Norfolk, no Marines on board. We were waiting to go in the shipyard in Boston for a regular overhaul. Had to watch on the quarterdeck, and this was in June. The captain came back from a meeting at the base and said, "Call all the officer and chief petty officers to the wardroom immediately," which I did. I got relieved and went in the wardroom. The captain said, "We got surprise orders." This was on a Thursday, so we had to get underway Sunday for parts unknown. Load all the spares, all the provisions, all the ammo. We didn't have anything but a 5-inch gun, but we did. I was assistant navigator and a boat division officer, so I asked the navigator, I said, "Mr. Badali, what charts do I get?" You drew paper charts in those days, and he said, "Get them for the whole damn world. We don't know where we're going." So the chief quartermaster and I went over in a couple of pickup truck loads of these damn paper charts, which we had to correct. The next thing we got, like on a Saturday, I was a comms officer too, so we got a message from CNO. It says, "You're detached from your amphibious squadron. You now report directly to the CNO." So nobody ever heard of that. The next message we got from him was, "Get underway immediately." This was on a Saturday, and in those days, immediately meant within 24 hours. And set a course of 090 and await further orders. So we did. After about 3 or 4 days, the quartermasters and I were talking, and then we said, "Mr. Badali, you know, if we don't get a change of order, we're going to hit the Canary Islands." So we didn't really worry about that. But the next order we got was to put into I don't remember the name of the dang port, Port Leote, and get our op orders. We were going to do, this was a cover story now, we were going to do an amphibious landing in the Med. So we went and picked up our op orders, and we didn't think that was going to happen. There's nothing else much in the Med. But the next orders we got were go to Gibraltar and anchor and await further orders. So we went to Gibraltar and anchored. And the captain said, "You know, we don't know much about Liberty. We better let the guys go ashore a little bit here." So we put the Liberty boats in. We had plenty of Liberty boats, and all those LCVP and a couple of LCM. And wouldn't you know it, as soon as they got ashore, we got another order from CNO, said, "Get underway immediately." And so we had to send the shore patrol over and get all the guys back, run them from one bar to another. But then we figured out our next orders would go to Suda Bay, Crete, and pick up some Marines. So we went into Suda Bay, picked up 800 Marines. A battalion landing team on an APA in those days was 1,800 men, as I said before. We picked up 800 Marines. They weren't a unit, but they'd been assembled from every little post in around the Med. And we began to figure out what might be up here. So after we got loaded, we kept getting these orders. Of course, it was for deception purposes that these were sent. They said, "Go to Suez Canal and wait further orders." So we went to the Suez. And then our next orders would go to Colombo, Ceylon, Sri Lanka now, and refuel. And so we did that. Next orders were put into Japan. And we had a week there. We picked up 1,000 Marine recruits, believe this now, whose recruit training had been cut in half. Our 800 Marines, our 1,000 recruits, was our battalion landing team. They had no training together. They were not a unit, but they did a super job. I don't remember exactly the timing, but we had, as I said, about a week or so there. And then we joined up and went in, execute the landing. It was well planned, well organized. I don't know if you remember, in those days, the LVTs went in first, and then the LCVPs. And the LCVPs were organized into waves, 7 boats full of Marines, spread out this way, about 100 feet apart. And the wave commander was an ensign or a JG. And I was the wave commander of the first wave in the Blue Beach. We didn't have any opposition except for sniper fire. And we had, after the first wave landed, then the succeeding waves, we went back to the ship and kept going until we had unloaded all our 1,800 Marines. So that's my best memory of the activity. We had some other. It was only a few days that the whole thing was executed. The thing I remember most that was striking to me was seeing the LSTs 100 yards up in the mud at low tide. Our next speaker was that very same day, doing many of those things. Oh, I was reminded of another story I just told. Being a wave commander, I had to be kind of up in the LCVP to see where the hell we're going. And we get the sniper fire coming in, so I didn't know what to do any better. I pulled out my .45 and started shooting at the beach. And the Marine sergeant says, "God damn it, sir," he says, "get down here in the boat." So anyhow, our next speaker is a Marine, Colonel Warren Weedhand.
I think I'm the token Marine. There any other Marines in the crowd? Ever been a Marine? God, I'm in trouble. I joined the Marine Corps in 1948, quit high school, joined the Marine Corps, promised my mother I'd serve 3 years in the Marine Corps and get out and go to college. Went to Tsingtao, China in 1948. Communists took over in 1949, and we were sent back to Camp Pendleton. I was in the 5th Marine Regiment, fully anticipating getting out of the Marine Corps and going to college. June 24th, 1950, I was sitting at a bar down in San Diego, a place we frequented often, and my buddy and I were just sitting there talking at the bar, and the bartender came over and he said, "You guys Marines?" And we said, "What's it to you?" He said, "Well, you better get your ass back to Camp Pendleton because you're going to war." We said, "War? Where the hell where are we going to war?" He said, "Korea." My buddy said, "Where's Korea?" True story, honest to God. Well, we soon found out. We got back to the 5th Marines at Camp Pendleton. We started to reorganize, and as if you've read anything about the Korean War or that period of time between 1945 and 1949, 1950, the military, Navy and Marine Corps in particular, were emasculated. Our ships were in poor shape. Our Marine Corps units were in worse shape. We had cadre platoons and cadre companies, and but we soon found out where Korea was, because in the middle of July, we went down to San Diego again and boarded USS Enrico, which is an AKA, which we loved it because they had good food, being a supply ship, and we started for Korea, and we got out about maybe 10 or 12 hours, and one of the boilers broke down, one of the ships that had been put in mothballs, so we limped into Oakland, California to get a boiler repaired, and that's the good news. The bad news is that the Marines weren't allowed any liberty. The Marines stayed on board ship and went out on a dock and drilled, and the Navy went on liberty. Now, I can't prove that story. I can't, but it makes a good story. Anyhow, we finally left Oakland, and our next destination was Sasebo. And we almost had an administrative loading aboard the ship. We were not prepared for any type of landing. And so we're going to go into Sasebo, pick up more supplies, and reload and go into to Pusan, which is, as you know, the port down south. But the situation in Korea had deteriorated to such a point that MacArthur requested that we were part of what's called the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, which was made up primarily around the 5th Marine Regiment. So we went past Sasebo and right into Pusan. We landed at Pusan, and within 24 hours we were in combat. And I mean fierce fighting in combat. In addition to that, because the North Koreans were just absolutely positively determined that they could take Pusan in a very short period of time. They had crossed the Naktong River 2 or 3 times. The Army had pushed them back. They'd pushed their way back across the Naktong again, and the Marine Brigade landed. I'm not suggesting that the Marine Brigade saved Korea. Any brigade would, reinforcements coming in, but we pushed them back across the Naktong. We fought. And one of the worst things about that period of time, which was in July and August, was it was just hotter than Hades. And we literally lost more Marines to heat prostration than we did to enemy fire. After MacArthur made his decision, which is another story which I've just read about, I read everything I can on Korea, we backloaded, or we went back to Miryang, and we're going to go into the Inchon landing. when the bad guys crossed the Naktong River again, and we were called and put back into the lines, we pushed them back a second time or third time. Finally, MacArthur said, "You got to get those Marines back. They're the nucleus. There are 2 regiments now. The first Marine Regiment and the 5th Marine Regiment, and the 5th Marine Regiment would take the point going into the Inchon landing." We backloaded and went around and headed for Inchon. Now, I'm a Marine. I was a PFC at the time, and I'd ridden on ships before, and I was accustomed to the PA speaker saying, "Now hear this, now hear this. The working party lay down to swab this, or the working party do this." I was accustomed to that. But the loudspeaker came on and said, "Okay, all you Marines in a working party, now hear this. Lay down to the hole. You got to make ladders." I turned to the gunny. I said, "What the hell you mean we got to make ladders?" He says, "I don't know what's going on, but we're going down in the hole because the old man said go down the hole, we're going to make ladders." Those ladders that you saw, and I don't know whether they can throw that picture back up again, but you've seen them. The ladders were nothing more than 2x4s, which we were down in a hole. We had nothing but hand saws. We sawed the ladders and made ladders. But we still didn't know what the ladders were for. Now, when you're a PFC in the rear ranks, you don't get told a hell of a lot about what's going on up on the day. We see what the hell are we doing with these ladders? We still didn't know. Well, we soon found out because they said we're going to land at Inchon and we're going to land against the seawall, and of course the ramp couldn't come down, and we had to use the ladders to get up out of the LCVPs up onto the top of the seawall. Now, something a lot of people don't even think about until you talk to them is the fact that on the other side of the seawall was marsh, backwater. So we're accustomed, Marines are accustomed to making an amphibious assault, even against the seawall, and you're all in a line, and when you get to the top, you attack straight ahead, right? Well, we couldn't, because when you got to the top of the seawall, you had to go all down single file until you got to the flat part, and then we attacked inland from there. There wasn't, I think as my friend here said, there wasn't a hell of a lot of enemy fire at that time, because seriously, MacArthur was either lucky or, he really was. Of course, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had all recommended that the last place in the world that you wanted to land on was Inchon, but we landed there and we were successful. But there was not a lot of opposition, significant opposition, until we began to move inland, and then the next objective was the airfield, and then the next objective was the city of Seoul, which took us about 2 weeks before we liberated Seoul. And we backloaded, went back to Inchon, and I'll never forget going back, because the tide was out, and there were those LSTs sitting on the mud like this. I talked to some of them later. They said it was a hell of a way. We couldn't even cook breakfast, They were sitting on their sides there. So then we backloaded and went around, and then went around and landed at Wonsan, which is another story that not for today, but you should really read and write and listen about, because you talk about there were no mines in Inchon. Well, there sure as hell were a lot of mines in Wonsan. And matter of fact, we circled out there for about 8 days, making big circles in the water, getting sick as hell, before they came in and cleared the mines and went into Wonsan. And by the time we went into Wonsan to go up into the Chosin Reservoir, Bob Hope had already landed and was having... And this is a true story. Because there weren't that many North Koreans up there, they were all cut off and down in the south. Bob Hope had come up from Seoul and welcomed me. He had a great big sign. Bob Hope welcomes the Marines to Wonsan. We never quite lived that down. But then we got to board trucks and went up into the Chosin Reservoir. I mentioned the Chosin Reservoir only because it was just cold, cold, cold. I'm looking at the TV the other night, and someplace up in the north it was 22 below zero. And my wife said, "Boy, that's cold." I said, "Well, let me tell you something. We were fighting in the Chosin Reservoir. It was 34 below zero. And not only was it 34 below zero, but it was 34 below zero 24 hours a day that you were out in that once the Chinese hit us up there. But the story is not of what we did in the Chosin Reservoir. That's another time. But when we came back to Hungnam, as we came out of the pass, and I looked out there and I saw all those gray bottoms, I said, you know, I never particularly cared much for the Navy, but now I do. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to introduce the next speaker because I was, for the 50th anniversary of Korea, I went back and his boss at that time, who was Captain Schilling, who was a CO of the Lyman Simpson DD 729, was with us. God bless his soul, he's gone now. But our next speaker, Joe Dixon, was on the Lyman Simpson. It's my pleasure to introduce him. Joe?
Well, I have to start before the invasion ever started, because we were anchored in Tokyo Bay in the middle of June, and we got a message in. I was a cryptologist, and the radioman by the name of Robert Consalvo, he looked more like about a 12-year-old boy than he did a sailor, came to my stateroom. We were, both the captain and I were in our staterooms. He was in his cabin, he was in his undershorts with 2 fans. I'm in my stateroom in my undershorts with 1 fan because it was so blasted hot. It was about 92 degrees inside that little tin can. And Robert said to me, he said, Mr. Dixon, we have a priority coded message. I got up and walked up to the coding room, broke the message, and I could not believe what I was reading as it came out. That's when they crossed the Korea. The North Koreans had come into South Korea, and we had orders to get underway and to go. We were in Tokyo Bay. We had to go to Sasebo and pick up a company of Army MPs under the command of Major Baer, and from there we were to take them to Pusan. And when I backed out the ship from the pier, I asked the skipper, I says, what do you want to do? He says, all ahead flank. So we went out of Tokyo Bay, flank speed, and you should have seen the sandpans doing this over on the shore. I'm sure we were cursed out just about every possible language you could imagine, but we steamed all night and we got into Sasebo. We got a drink. As people know, that means you need fuel. We loaded the company of MPs aboard, and we had to take them to Pusan. And so we pulled in and tied up to Pusan, and we were told to stay there awaiting orders to what to go from there. We didn't know. And I'm up on the bridge with the captain, and all of a sudden he looks at me and he says, Joe, would you like to have some fun? I says, what do you got in mind? He says, well, get a hold of Guns, which is the chief gunner's mate, to bring up a 45 with 22 barrel and a couple of boxes of ammo, because I'm going to tell you, in Pusan, I have never seen rats that large. They were about the size of a rat terrier dog. Unbelievable. Anyway, the skipper and I set up on the bridge and we fired at the rats on the pier, waiting for orders what we were going to do next. So then we finally got orders to return to Sasebo, and we went back to Sasebo, and all of a sudden the rumors began to fly that we knew something was coming about, but we didn't know what. And I knew the skipper was going to many, many meetings of the squadron commander, and he came back and he says, we're going to make a landing at Inchon. I'm sorry. Anyway, we pulled into Inchon, and I don't agree with this gentleman here. because I was told when we went in, the tides were ebbing, and we were told the tides were 26 feet, and second only to the Bay of Fundy in tides. I can assure you, when they start flowing or ebbing, the current is very, very swift. And we put down 2 anchors in the mud, hoping we could stay there. And I might add, the day of the Inchon invasion was probably the most boring day I ever spent in my life. Because being the officer of the deck of the ship, all I had to do was to keep taking bearings on things ashore to make sure that we weren't dragging anchor. After we were able to get out of Inchon, then they decided we would go up and down the east and west coast of Korea, and we would do what they call interdiction fire. And I've yet to find out who is harassed the most, the people ashore or the people on the ship, because we we kicked out a 5-inch shell every 5 minutes. And of course, you know, sleeping under such circumstances is not the best in the world. Let's see, I've got my notes here so I don't forget anything. Okay, we had to go back into the channel. We went in the channel the first time on the 13th, I think it was. I have the copy of the Navy log with me that I gave to Annette. She has the copy of the ship's log that I wrote most of it. The day of the invasion, I stood for something like 30 hours, and the whole thing is my writing that I made the ship's log. And that's the day of the invasion. We left the channel because David H. Swenson had been killed. He was standing on my right, and we were practically touching shoulders. And on my left is John Noonan. Now, the ironic thing about this, David's out of the class of 48, I'm out of the class of 49, and John Noonan was out of the class of 50 from the academy. And when David got hit, excuse me, all I could say, I still don't know what hit him. The skipper thinks it was shrapnel. I think it was a bullet from one of the tanks ashore. But anyway, it completely just about made, excuse me, made sausage out of him. He fell on me, he was going down, he's lying on my feet, and I just looked down and says, well, they got Swede. Anyway, the chief corpsman came up and got a hold of Noonan because he was had been scalped and he was bleeding profusely, and he was beginning to turn white, and he went into deep shock. Excuse me. Anyway, the chief corpsman took him down to the wardroom, which, you know, during the war on a destroyer is the operating room, whatever you want to call it. And they gave him a shot to knock him out so he wouldn't be too much thing. But I might add, unfortunately, John never got over that, and he only lived 3 years after the incident. Now, the decision was made by Admiral Struble, who was the task force commander in Korea, that we'd bury Swede at sea. Now, the last picture is Swede being buried at sea. And he had roomed across the hall from me at the academy because his room did not have a bathroom, but my roommate and I did have a bathroom, and they had to use our showers to get cleaned. So I had known Swede for a year before we went aboard the Swenson. I was recommended for the Silver Star by my commanding officer, Captain Robert A. Schelling, which I consider one of my best friends I ever had in the Navy. And I don't know how many Navy people we have here, but he qualified me to be an officer of the deck, both in port and underway, within 6 weeks after I reported aboard from the academy. I had classmates that did not get qualified for at least 6 months or almost a year. And when I told them that I was qualified in 6 weeks to underway, they couldn't believe it. But that's the way the captain treated me. Now, that's all I have to say about the Inchon invasion. If I go any further, I'm going to get very emotional.
I want to say something.
Okay.
I would like to say one more thing. You won't believe this. Today at the International Navy's lunch, Joe and I happened to sit next to each other. We knew we were classmates. We didn't know we'd been in Inchon together.
I have one other thing to say about Swede. It's unbelievable. When we buried him at sea, as you can see, the Toledo is in front, the destroyer on the other side, that's a Swenson. Now, our executive officer, a man by the name of Neil Weatherly, was growing orchids in his stateroom. And so when they slipped Swede into the sea, he cut 3 orchid blossoms and said, at least bury him with some flowers. Thank you.
Are there any questions for our panel tonight? Gentlemen, any more remarks? It was terrific. Thank you very much for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, the landing at the Battle of Inchon.